Hey guys, it's great to see you. See you, Amy. Hi, I'm David Ingle. I'm the pastor of this church, Holy Sepulchre, London. And these guys are some of our worship team. Like many churches, worship is right at the heart of what we do. We worship God for many things, for his love, his power, his forgiveness, for all that Jesus has done for us. But one thing we never seem to worship God for is his judgment. In fact, it might strike you as odd even to mention that. Surely no one worships God for his judgment. But actually, that's a problem. We worship God because he's worthy of our worship. We believe that he is good and perfect in every way. And there's nothing dark or wrong about him. Every aspect of his character is worthy of worship. And the problem is that the Bible tells us that that includes judgment. In fact, it's got a lot to say about it. And it describes God as a God who judges. For instance, Jesus told a parable in which he describes himself as a judge, separating the righteous from the unrighteous, like a shepherd separating his sheep from goats. And he finishes with the words, "Then they, the goats, will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." And I think many of us find that idea pretty difficult, even shocking, that Jesus would talk about eternal punishment and describe himself as a judge. How could a God of love also be a God of judgment? How can we reconcile that with everything else that we know about Jesus, his love, his compassion, his forgiveness? And that is what this little film series is really all about. I've called it Struggling with Judgment because I find this really hard. I struggle with it. And this series won't be about waving my finger about you or trying to tell you that you're awful or anything like that. It's more of a journey together as we explore and find out how actually God's judgment can be okay. And not just okay, but something positive, part of his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Something that we might even pick up a guitar and start worshipping him for. I don't think I'm quite there yet, but a couple of years ago, I came across a psalm that really encouraged me on this journey. It's Psalm 98. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Burst into jubilant song with music. Make music to the Lord with the harp and the sound of singing, with trumpets and the blast of the ram's horn. Shout for joy before the Lord, the King. Let the sea resound and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Let them sing before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples with equity. This is one of the most joyful, exuberant, and celebratory songs in the whole book. Rivers clapping their hands, mountains singing for joy. It paints quite a picture. And yet, at the end of it all, the thing that the psalmist is worshipping God for is his judgment. When I first realized that, it was a bit of a shock to me. But it also really encouraged me. It encouraged me that it is possible to worship God for his judgment. And it hinted that maybe there was something I just wasn't getting, something I didn't understand, something that we're all missing. And as I've dug around into what the Bible has to say about judgment, I think that that is what I've found, that there's more here than I realized, that there is an answer to the question, why does God judge? And it all starts with the word, judgment. In English, we tend to think of that in purely negative terms. We think of things like punishment or imprisonment. But in the Bible, judgment is much bigger than that. And crucially, much more positive than that. The Hebrew word for judgment is shaphat. And while punishment is a part of it, it's primarily about something positive. Shaphat means to put things right, to restore them to the way that they should be. It's about making the world a better place. Perhaps in some ways it's closer to the English word for justice. One Hebrew dictionary sums it up like this. Shaphat describes a range of actions that restore or preserve order in society so that justice, especially social justice, is guaranteed. It can be translated as rule, govern, deliver, rescue, or judge. When I read that, I immediately find myself thinking about another biblical theme that we tend to be a whole lot more excited about: salvation. One biblical book that tends to confuse people is the book of Judges. When we read it, a lot of us find ourselves wondering where all the judges went to. We assume that the title is talking about judges in law courts, ruling on cases, handing down sentences, and so on. But there's not many of them in the book at all. Instead, we have a parade of charismatic heroes, men like Gideon, women like Deborah, who rescue and deliver the people of Israel from oppression by their enemies. But that is what the Bible thinks of as a judge. And all the crazy and dramatic stories of how they rescue the people of Israel from their enemies are what the Bible thinks of as judgment. Putting things right, establishing justice, restoring things to the way that they should be. Which is a whole lot better than what we normally think of when we think about judgment. And yet, there are still some snags, some difficulties. If you're an Old Testament Israelite, the book of Judges is a great read. It's full of good news. It's about rescue, restoration, and salvation. But if you're an Ammonite, a Midianite, or a Philistine, it's a different story. In fact, it's a catalogue of defeat and disaster. And while in the Bible, judgment and salvation go together, and there always is this positive element, there is still the negative. And a lot of what we read in the Bible about judgment is extraordinarily difficult. I think of parts of the Old Testament which speak about the fall of Jerusalem or the exile. Books like Lamentations and Ezekiel have descriptions of pain and suffering which in their intensity are almost unbearably heartbreaking. Or if we skip forward to the New Testament and think, say, of those words of Jesus about eternal punishment that I mentioned earlier, or some of the visions of judgment that we find in the book of Revelation, it's difficult not to find them hard. And yet I think it's important that we do realize that these passages of judgment are not about a God who wants to destroy us or to smite us. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. There's a beautiful verse in 2 Peter which describes how God does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants all to turn away from their sins. And the destruction and suffering that's wound up with judgment is something that God longs to save us from. In many ways, that's the story of the Bible, as God cries out to us and pleads with us to repent and turn back to Him so that we might live, so that we might not fall under His judgment. Which raises the question, why then does God judge? Or perhaps more specifically, why does the Bible suggest that judgment and salvation come together? Why can't we have heaven without hell, love without punishment, salvation without judgment? Well, as a pastor, I often find myself talking with people about the things that they struggle with when it comes to faith. This theme of judgment is a big one. But the biggest, perhaps the issue that people struggle with more than any other, is suffering. Why does God allow suffering? We look around us at the world and we see so much suffering and heartache, from the violence and horrors of war and famine that we see on our TV screens, to the things that each of us struggle with, from stress to broken relationships and ultimately death. And something deep within us cries out, why? It's as though we know that we were created for something better. Things shouldn't be like this. When we pick up the Bible, we find that same longing for a world without pain and suffering. If you read books like Psalms or Lamentations, they're full of struggle and darkness. People crying out to God, why? How long? Help me. And yet alongside the pain and struggle is a realization that suffering doesn't just happen. Where does it come from? Well, tragically, the answer is us. At the root of almost all the pain and suffering in this world are our actions, the things that we do wrong, what the Bible calls sin. And sometimes that's direct and obvious, the suffering that comes from violence or injustice. But more often, it's indirect, when we suffer as a result of other people's actions, or simply because we live in a broken and sinful world in which pain and struggle, dishonesty and difficulty are just part of life. And so there may not be any specific link between my sin and my suffering. And yet on a bigger, more general level, sin and suffering are bound up together. Because at the root of almost all the pain and suffering that we see in this world is ultimately sin. And that means that if God is going to put an end to suffering, he also needs to put an end to sin. Which brings us back to judgment, because that is what judgment is all about. It's the punishment, yes, but the putting an end to sin. We long for a world in which pain and suffering are no more, for the paradise that we read about at the end of the Bible, in which there's no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. But before that can happen, first, God needs to judge, because the problem and pains of sin need to have been dealt with. And that's a difficult message for many of us to hear, because we don't tend to think that our sin is that big a deal. We're happy with the idea that Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot might need to be judged. In fact, many of us would demand it. But we struggle much more with the idea that we too deserve judgment. And yet the Bible is very clear that we do. It says, there is no one righteous, not even one. And much of this film series will be wrestling with that central issue of why our sin is such a big deal. And we'll be looking at some of the images that the Bible uses to help us understand the seriousness of sin. But I want to finish this film on a different note, reflecting on that tension between suffering and judgment. Through much of the Old Testament, we seem to face an awful choice. Would we have a world without judgment, in which case we have to accept suffering? Or would we have a world without suffering, in which case we have to accept judgment? But then as we turn to the New Testament, a third choice is made possible. And it's the way of redemption, the way of forgiveness, the way of the cross. Because at the cross, Jesus takes upon himself the sins of the world. At the cross, Jesus takes on himself the judgment that I deserve. At the cross, Jesus makes it possible for me to be both judged and forgiven. And we'll look at the glories of the cross and how that is all possible later on in this series. But for now, I wanted to finish this first session there, because you cannot speak about what the Bible has to say about judgment without also speaking about the cross. We often say that the cross is the ultimate expression of God's love, and it is. But it is also the ultimate expression of his judgment. And we saw earlier how God's judgment is all about setting the world to rights, putting things back to the way they should be, making the world a better place. In fact, making the world the best possible place. But at the same time, we realized that we need to have the pain and punishment of dealing with our sin. Well, the wonderful news of the cross is that God offers us all the good stuff: salvation, paradise, eternal life, while at the same time taking on himself all the bad stuff: sin, death, judgment. And that's what the cross is all about. And that is the best news forever.
What were people's immediate thoughts as that video came to a close? Oh, hang on. Video was playing again. So, yeah, do people find God's judgment something easy to worship?
I find it easier to worship than not worship, because they're not out of being self-righteous, but out of a kind of like, I want to see people who've done bad things have bad things happen to them. Basically, pretty simplistic, but yeah.
Well, the thing that kind of hit me was how he said, would we rather have a world without judgment and suffering, or a world without suffering but with judgment? And I thought that was an interesting kind of ultimatum he gave there, and then kind of going on to saying, well, you know, the third option is forgiveness. But as I look around in the world, is that the way the world is? You know, do we experience God's judgment here and now, or is it something that is just, I don't know, somewhere a long way in the future? And for me, I think it's typically been something that I've not wanted to worship like God for, because I feel like the judgment of God that I was presented with as a child in my own faith is probably different to the way I would see it now. But the thing that I did really appreciate out of that video, that I think probably for the first time that made me want to worship God for his judgment, was that idea of, in order to end suffering, there needs to be some kind of justice.
I like the fact that he started off with Psalm 98. I've often used that psalm for to start off services, because it's such an exuberant psalm, and yet I felt quite awkward with the way it ends, you know. It's like you're celebrating God with all these things, and then why are we celebrating him? Well, because he's coming to judge the earth. And I really resonated with David's sort of angst, you know, like it doesn't quite feel like something that we want to worship him for. But but I really like the way he turned it round and he connected it with justice. Because I think when you think of judgment as being simply the putting right of things that are wrong, um, then it's a really good thing, isn't it? Um, and it's like the idea of righteousness. You know, God gives us His righteousness, and why is it? What is God's righteousness? Well, I like to think of it as Him putting things right, and God is about putting things right. And if that's what judgment is about, it's about coming to actually, you know, it's a bit like for me, it's a bit like the plumb line thing. You know, there's an image in Amos, I think, of a plumb line. And in the old days, a builder would use the plumb line to test whether the building was straight or not. And if the wall that he was building wasn't straight, then he'd adjust the wall so that it was in keeping with the plumb line, and the plumb line was there really to judge the wall. And it was exercising some form of sort of justice, because the plumb line was actually saying, is this right or not? And if it's not right, we need to make it right. And that form of sort of correcting things is actually about judgment, isn't it? So I like that. When you think it's not the way I normally think, and I still find I have to do mental gymnastics to get there, because every time somebody says judgment, I still think negative. But I can actually see when you talk today about sort of like restorative justice, not just punitive justice. You know, justice isn't just about punishing someone; it's actually about restoring things as they should be. And I think God is into restorative justice, and His judgment is about realigning things so that they're just right. And that's what righteousness means. It's putting things right, and God's justice is so yeah, anyway. I think I can see that, but I still have to think my way into it. But I think when you look at it through that lens, and that's what I think David was helping us to do, see it really positively.
Yeah.
And the world certainly needs putting right. And without that, nothing will change. You know, we've had enough of the slogans. We need somebody who can actually change things and put things right. And if that's what it means to talk about God coming to judge, then that's probably a good thing for me.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that particular aspect before I move on to one of the discussion questions I've just got in my mind?
Go on then. What's the question then?
Well, we talk about, you know, particularly as we read these Psalms, it gives this active sense of God bringing His judgment. And I suppose my question is, do we experience the judgment of God here and now, or is it only an eschatological thing, a thing after death?
Well, we probably do experience it here and now, but we're not aware of it because we can't weigh up what is judgment and what is just happening. And also, I know there's so much that comes out from some pastors' mouths that isn't as wise as Reverend Ingo or Andy. And there was something on the news today about some evangelical American pastors saying that Trump lost the election because he supported LGBTQ. I mean, like, you know, and you kind of think, what? You know, there's so much confusing stuff in the media about judgment that I think it's good to have a video like this. And in fact, Andy, you got me on the right track at the beginning, because I'd never thought about a judge and justice. I'd always thought about judgment a bit negatively. But in fact, I was a while ago doing restorative justice courses in a women's prison. I did it for about 5 years. And it was a while, I haven't done it for about 5 years. But it was incredible, actually. And so it sort of just come back to me just now when you mentioned that. So it's quite good to look at this really positively and constructively, isn't it?
I was thinking of we saw the film about Nelson Mandela. His what's it called?
Long Walk to Freedom.
Freedom.
Yeah.
And although it doesn't talk about it there are moments where Desmond Tutu comes in, and he was he headed up the commission for what do they call it, for
Truth and Reconciliation.
And Reconciliation Commission. And it was like a bold experiment, which in some ways failed, but I think in one very fundamental way it succeeded, in that it avoided the sort of genocide that we've seen in some countries, where you've got tribes turning on each other. And it could have been that. We could have seen the most awful bloodshed in South Africa, as blacks turned against whites and this and that, and in a sense wanting to exercise their own form of justice, which was like punitive justice, wanting to judge the whites for their for the incredibly unjust system that they'd been the objects of. But because there was this attempt to do the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they were bringing the perpetrators of injustice together with the victims of injustice, and there was a sort of dialogue going on, it's almost like it was a sort of social experiment in forgiveness. And I don't know how far that could ever possibly work in a human context, but I thought it was interesting that it was led by the Archbishop of South Africa, and that it was clearly for him a spiritual exercise, and that it was only possible because that's what God's like. So although I think a lot of God's justice probably only ultimately will be exercised, or will only understand it at the end of time, there must be ways in which we can be part of that process in a positive way. No, I don't mean we're the ones who judge everybody, but in some way we can surely be part of the process by which God makes things right. Even if we can't interpret. I think it's like you say, Carolyn, I think it's much more difficult to interpret events as being an act of God's judgment. But if you turn it around and you think God is actually not ignoring the world and waiting until the last day before he acts, he's doing things all the time. He's restoring people all the time. He's bringing healing. His kingdom is coming in. We just don't see it all the time. And some of the time we just see the pain. But I think he is at work bringing good things, isn't he? And so there must be forms of justice that God is already beginning to work out, even if we don't see the whole thing. But I was really struck by the South African example. I mean, how courageous is that? To think of a different type of judgment that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very brave, isn't it, to go against the grain of what is usually always that tit for tat, an eye for an eye response. And I think it feels like our society now, even now, there's often this this similar justice where we're looking to make someone pay. It's always trying to blame someone to make them pay for something. And I think it does take a brave leader to stand up and say, I'm not going to count these sins against them, and actually we're just going to take responsibility for it, which is, I suppose, what archetypally that's what Christ does. He takes responsibility for the sins of the world.
But isn't it interesting that we instinctively feel that things are fair or unfair? And if they're unfair, then we want something done about it.
Or if they're unfair in our direction.
Most of the time, yeah. But isn't that the basis by which we judge other people? Because we consider that they've got it wrong and we've got it right. You know, it's like that the whole principle, the idea of judging on the basis that something must be right and something must be wrong, and that if the rights are not, if wrongs are not dealt with, then something's not right, and you know that's like a cry for judgment somewhere, isn't it? It's like it's really, we don't like it, but it's actually innate in us. When we're the objects of injustice, or we see people who are, it something just feels so wrong about that, and I cannot imagine a God who would ignore that. And even when it's not well placed, even when we're judging others because we feel hard done by and it's not legitimate, there's still that feeling that somehow, somewhere, there ought to be, things ought to be right, and it's not good that they're not. Does that make sense? You know, and that must come from somewhere.
Yeah, because it starts so young, doesn't it? From being a child, looking to one's parents. You know, you appeal to this higher power.
It's not fair.
Through to school with teachers, and then I suppose as we become adults, it almost becomes the next level up is the state, isn't it? We look for the state to judge, but actually, because the state is only just human as well, it is not all powerful. It can't exercise that same level of omniscient, perfect judgment and justice.
Quite a
Sorry.
judgment as well. Like obviously God at times has a hand in things, but I don't know if that's the same as like, oh, each time God puts his role in something, that's a judgment, because a judgment is quite final. Like when you've had your chances and you took advantage of an opportunity you had maybe, and your parents are like, that's final, that's my judgment. Or when you've been as far as you can with something legal, you've been to the Supreme Court, it's final. But I feel like that's what's so kind of frustrating about judgment, is it feels so far off, and we don't know how people are going to respond to the kind of opportunities and way God guides our lives, and the way he's not, where he doesn't seem to be stepping in. Yeah, it does feel kind of frustrating and tedious and more scary, because there's no way of knowing how that judgment's going to go, because of its finality. Yeah. So interrupted.
I think there have definitely been times in my life when actually I've really needed the judgment of God, I suppose, through other people, to make me more aware of not just myself but of other people. I can certainly think of relationships where I've not treated people the way I should have done, and actually it's almost like reality came to bite me back for it, and you know, breaking friendships, ruining breaking hearts, etc. That showed, you know, the pain of that showed me the result of my actions. And I think that in a way was a bit of judgment, because when you see the result of your actions and the pain that can cause, you know, I would hope that for most of us that stirs us to want to change and to be better. But I suppose that's not something that always happens for everyone. You don't always see the result of your actions straight away, and even if you do, there are a lot of people that they see other people that are hurt, and for some reason they don't seem to care.
It's interesting thinking of it from a parent's point of view. There's a link between discipline that you exercise, correction, and punishment. It's all sort of part of the same thing, isn't it? Like the when you discipline a child. If you didn't discipline your children, they would never learn. So there's a corrective sort of educational side to needing to discipline your children and tell them off when they get things wrong. You need, and if needs be, you punish them. But it's with a view to them learning the lesson and not doing it again. But it's corrective. Do you know what I mean? It's not, a good parent isn't just going to punish their kids for the sake of it, because you love them. You're gonna, if anything, you're going to try and exercise the smallest amount of punishment possible, without being indulgent, and so that they learn the lesson, but not any more than is necessary. And it makes me think about, in Hebrews 12, where the author says, don't be discouraged by what you're going through, because God disciplines those he loves. And there's almost a sense in which some of the things that we could see as judgment, or we don't understand why they happen, it's actually God in some way. I don't know whether he inflicts it or he allows it, but it's a form of correction. Does that make sense? So that we learn. It's just like when you put your hand in the fire, you get burnt, don't you? Now, if that didn't happen, you'd do it and you wouldn't realize. So there are consequences, and I guess with the Lord, maybe it's the same thing, and maybe that happens here and now. We don't need to wait until the end of time. Actually, the Lord is correcting us, and some of that can be felt like judgment, or it can be felt like punishment, but actually it's corrective. And so it's trying to shape us, but we don't really understand it at the time. And it's only sometimes when we look back on it and we go, wow, if I hadn't had that, I really would have been in trouble. Or that really helped to shape the way I see things, and now I do it differently, just like a parent with their children. And that's quite an interesting one, isn't it? The idea that judgment might be more corrective, more discipline based in a positive way. It's sort of like to try and orientate us the right way. And that parent side of things, I think, is quite helpful for me.
Is that judgment?
Well, it's judgment in the sense that you're punishing things that are wrong. You're correcting misbehavior. If our kids do something wrong, you correct it, and that's a way of exercising judgment, isn't it? You're saying over their behavior that it was wrong, and you're exercising a role of a judge in a sense, but you're not doing it in a punitive way. You're not trying to punish them or crush them, but you are trying to bring them back to reality and to say this is wrong, and you're exercising a form of judgment between whether it's right or wrong, and then hoping that they'll learn from it, aren't you?
Maybe. Don't know.
Isn't there kind of a distinction also with the response of, when a child does something bad, and as a parent they really, wind you up, and what they're doing is wrong. There's a temptation, isn't there, to either to lash out and just punish for the sake of soothing your kind of rage or wrath, but then there's also the kind of more measured and calm response, which is telling off and rebuking or punishing in a way that isn't just to soothe your own wrath. And that really feeds all of that debate around smacking children in the UK at the moment, because they say a lot of the time it's parents are doing it just out of rage. And I suppose, if we think about it theologically, is God being the calm parent who carries out his justice in a kind of calm, collected way, but allows it to happen so that we learn to correct us? Or does that lashing out to soothe a rage ever happen? Because certainly what I was brought up to believe was the judgment of God, particularly on Jesus at the cross, that was that lashing out moment. And I just don't know. I don't know if I still hold to that anymore.
Bible talks about the anger of God, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The wrath of God.
I'm not very clear about, I mean, I think sort of the parent image. So for me, judgment is actually where God takes a very clear stance, a bit like the parent saying, this is the limit, this is right, and this is wrong. But I don't feel when we suffer the consequences of our bad actions towards others or in situations or whatever, and then by the grace of God, we realize that we messed up. For me, that's not judgment. For me, that's God giving me the intelligence to actually learn from the lesson. But that's not judgment, because God's not getting directly involved, saying this is right, this is wrong. This is me realizing and learning the lesson or not. So
Is
I
there
think
such a thing?
judgment is much more kind of, for me, it's like a much more direct kind of, God comes in and he takes a stance and he says, this is right, this is wrong, rather than me learning through life. So I think there's a lot less judgment that I can see than.
But you're not challenging the idea that God's judging, it's the way he's judging. That you're No, he doesn't seem to intervene.
No, I don't think there is sort of direct intervention all the time. I think
he did that with Noah, didn't he?
Mm.
You know, he caused the flood to come as judgment on the people, but then afterwards he said, I'll never ever do that again.
Yeah.
And it's almost like his form of judgment has changed so that he'll allow things to happen, but it's never without consequence. And
No.
and it's almost like there's an auto.
But the judgment isn't there. I mean, I still feel, you know, if you, what's his name? What's his name?
David Ingle.
Yeah, we are very much in the suffering because there's no judgment time.
Yeah.
Or at least judgment we can see.
No, I can't see any direct judgment in the sense of God putting things right, like through direct intervention. This is what I have in mind when I hear.
Mm.
Don't I?
Yeah, I think I've always seen like there's two ways that God seems to intervene, either in that kind of direct sense, as you mentioned, Dutta, but also, you know, how we have like the laws of physics that govern reality, and if you try and mess with them, if I jump out the window, gravity pulls me down, and like it's the consequence of
yes.
Those
I call it suffering the consequences. For me, that's not judgment.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because I was just trying to think, like, are the two things the same within God's judgment? Because as I look around, at the world, some of the people that I've met in the past that have committed some pretty horrible things, and they end up realizing through the pain that they caused, they see the weight of that and then come to realize their actions. And it's definitely something I've done in my own life. But you think about people that just gather endless wealth, and all they think the only thing in life is to pursue money and financial gain, and they get to the end of it and realize life's not been worthwhile, and I've put my life in nothing. And the amount of suicides that you have in people that seem to be all successful according to the world's standards. So there's I don't know, it feels like there is definitely a little bit of God's judgment within the day-to-day consequential.
In that he's made a world that should be functioning in a certain way, and if it does, then it brings blessing.
Yes.
And if it doesn't, then clearly things are not right. And so the problem comes in that often it's not the people who perpetrate the injustice or that do the wrong thing that then suffer from it. That's what David Ingle said, wasn't it? It's not, there isn't a simple line between sin and suffering. So
Yeah.
you might do something wrong, and actually it's somebody else who suffers, and that's just a greater form of injustice. So it feels to me like whatever we say about God's judgment, it's always provisional, isn't it? That it's a very, very good thing that ultimately God will judge and everything will become clear. But I don't think that means that he doesn't start doing forms of judgment
Mm.
here, or at the very least, in the sense that there are inevitable consequences for people who step out of the way that he made things, and if we just like with the laws of physics, if God made the world in a certain way so that it would bring blessing, and we did, think of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they in the garden, they turned away from God, and the very first thing that happens is that they're cursed. Now, is that because God was vindictive? Actually, I think it feels more like that's just the consequence of what they've done. They stepped out of, that's right, they stepped over the boundaries, and the result was, this is what's going to happen. And I'm not sure God was pleased about it. I think he probably was completely distraught about it, and yet that is the consequence of stepping over the boundaries, because God is not indifferent to justice. He's a God of justice. He's a God who creates right and wrong. But it's also interesting that in the Bible, that's also the beginning of God then putting everything right again. But of course, Adam and Eve never saw that, and we don't fully see it. So there's a sort of future horizon that we believe will happen, and it's a good thing. Otherwise, everything would just be arbitrary, wouldn't it? Because what you're saying about the rich people, for every rich person you say who ends up committing suicide because they're unhappy, you've got an awful lot of rich people who seem to get away with it. It doesn't follow. And you've also got a lot of poor people who are victims of injustice, and there does not seem to be any fairness in the way that works out. So for me, there must be another horizon that we can't yet see, where God actually makes everything right. And we just have to trust him for that.
It's a bit like the kingdom, isn't it? The now and the not yet, to some extent. We witness some of it in this life, but we long for something more.
I was just going to say on restorative justice, actually, one thing that really struck me was that the women's prison I went to several times, so they were having their judgment. They were all serving prison sentences. So they got their judgment. But it was because their attitude, a lot of them just thought they didn't have any victims. A lot of them thought it was a financial crime. There were no victims. And it was getting them through the end of the 8 weeks to recognize there are always victims. This thing with dropping a pebble in a bowl of water and looking at the ripples, and then they'd bring in victims, wouldn't be their victims, obviously, but this very brave couple who'd come in time and time again and talk about how their son just out with some mates, got drunk, fell over in the road. His mates, laughed, thought it was funny, walked on, and then a car driven by a kid driver then ran over him, and somebody, I don't know, he got beaten up basically, and he died. And then, to see these women in the room just break down and recognize that, what started off, I think I've got some bits of the story a bit wrong there, but what started off as some minor crime then escalated into somebody dying. And a lot of these women realizing that, even though they might think, oh, all I did was, bank fraud or something, making them realize that that's somebody's granny and could be your granny or my granny, and so I used to find those courses really rewarding to be part of. Inevitably, there were some women who were so hardened that they didn't learn from it, but generally, by the end of it, you really felt that they had come sort of circle. They were still serving a sentence, and of course, you don't know, their hearts might be hardened again. But in that time, you felt that they'd kind of seen the light somewhere. So that's part of God's judgment working in an inner and an outer way, is how I saw it.
Thank you. I just had one thing that came into my head was, I can't remember where exactly it is, but when God says, seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God, that's a call for us as well, is to seek that justice as well.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's the social justice for those who are struggling really, financially, or in whatever way in society, or whether it's those committing like atrocities around the world. That's it's not something that I think we can just sit idly by and ignore, because God doesn't ignore it, you know.
Mm.
Those were judged for ignoring it as well, quite an extent.
Mm.
Mm. Two things I'd like to add about that. This idea of punitive and restorative judgment. I like this idea, but I would rather think as a spectrum of. It's not one or the other. I think there's a good balance about that, and in that sense, and I was thinking about these pinnacles of judgment over the Bible. We mentioned the flood, but also Sodom and Gomorrah. So many big deal judgments over the narrative of the Bible, in which it doesn't seem to be like we are facing any of these compared to these big, massive judgment events. In that sense, that tends to think like we are. It's not like God doesn't judge any longer in that way, but I don't know. That also makes me think about some other things, especially regarding pollution, but over the centuries, and the disaster our children will be facing, and in that sense, that also brings another dimension to judgment, not without being saying like it is God or it is only us. I think in that spectrum of we've done things wrong, and God is still right, and there is consequences over the years, that makes me think differently. The second thing I wanted to add, I forgot it. Wait. Restorative, punitive. Oh yeah. This idea. This idea. The image of the judgment, and we're thinking about a judge, but I would also add the image of the judge and also the advocate, and talking about the cross and Christ. I find it very fascinating to remind ourselves about if Christ, if God wouldn't send His own begotten Son for us, the sin wouldn't matter, and because if sin wouldn't matter, Jesus wouldn't die for it, and I think if God's justice is if God's righteousness implies that higher standard of judgment, I would say sin is a massive deal, and that always challenges me over the idea of sin, and and how unrighteous I am considering to God's standards and God's righteousness. Does make sense?
It leads quite nicely onto what's going to happen next week, I think. He takes a bit more of a focus on the nature of sin. You know, he touches on it a little bit in this video, but he moves on to that in the next video, which should hopefully provide us with a bit more content to wrestle with. Thanks, Timmy. I realised the time. We're over an hour now,
Okay.
and I don't want to, take it. We could talk about this subject for a long time because I think it's such a interesting one. But any kind of final thoughts people just really had on their mind that they just wanted to communicate before we go?
Yeah.
Yvonne?
Also, just the idea that God's judgment somehow changed, or like changed throughout the Bible, because I just feel like it can't change because like God's one thing that doesn't change, and He says that lots of times, and like I think our response to it definitely changes, and our literary interpretation of it definitely changes, like whether it was a flood or whether in the story of Sodom someone gave away their woman to be beaten up or something, and the ways we choose to deflect the idea of like our sin actually having the emotional weight of our sin actually having an impact that's so awful that it's got to be atoned, and to the point where there's got to be a final atonement. But I don't know, I find it weird on the time scale that if there is something that's a truth and what's right or wrong, that judgment can change. I don't know. It's just, I find that one hard to deal with because I just really believe that God's judgment can't actually change. Then that's like, why is Jesus around when he does? And then that's a whole other kettle of fish. So yeah. Sorry, that's what's niggling me. But, yeah, another time. Yeah.
I'm struck that in the Old Testament, they were quite quick to interpret things happening as God's judgment, either God's judgment on the nations around them when they were victorious, or God's judgment on their sin when things went wrong, and that was actually what the prophets all talked about, wasn't it? Their whole interpretation of the exile, for example, and the defeat of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, the exile. It's all interpreted as this is judgment on your unfaithfulness, and yet something seems to shift when Jesus comes. And I don't think that with Jesus judgment becomes less important, but it's almost like somehow it becomes it's focused in a different way, because I don't see in the New Testament that same sense of sort of like drawing immediate conclusions from things as being this is the judgment of God and stuff. But there is a similar sense of sin being significant and sin being extremely serious, but it's always then channeled back to Jesus. And I think that's why he was right to focus us in on the cross, because something happens at that point which is not a change of it's not God changing his mind about justice or about what needs judging, but somehow on the cross something finds its focus, which means that the way we relate to God's judgment actually changes. But I'm not sure how. Well, it'd be interesting to see where the next few weeks take us.
Yeah. Without spoiling the whole series in one night. I think that's
spoiler alert.
Yeah. Great. Good to kind of kick off these discussions. Next week, I think the topic of the title of the topic is Fixing What's Broken. So that'd be interesting to see what he goes with next. One thing I was going to say, just challenge people as they kind of go through the next week between now and next Wednesday, is just as you read particularly some of the Psalms as well, as he reflected on Psalm 98, I found that there's been a lot of Psalms that I read almost I can't get through that many Psalms without hearing some kind of praise and worship of God's judgment. So I just thought it'd be good to, as we go through the week, and we can maybe pick out a few Psalms to read ourselves, just to mull them over throughout the week before we come back to meeting next week. But other than that, I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you, Josh.